The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, because that's what we are aiming at here in Sesshin and in general in our practice, is to realize who we really are. And who are we really? There's a book that's come out in this past year that's very interesting, particularly with regard to Zen practice and our assumptions around it. It is called No Self, No Problem. And it was written by a neuropsychologist, a professor at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. His name is Chris Niebauer, and he's a Ph.D., and his field is neuropsychology. Specifically, he teaches the different roles of the right and left hemispheres of our brain. You probably already know that we have kind of two pieces of brain in our head, and they're connected, and they usually talk to each other. And interesting things happen when they can't talk to each other, and that has been discovered because there were some experiments done years ago that actually were successful for people who were had severe epilepsy that was not possible to treat successfully with medication. And so they finally decided that what was going on was the right and left parts of our brain were getting into, well, maybe we could euphemistically call it squabbles. And that was causing all kinds of problems. And if they cut the connection between the left and right brain, that things would simmer down. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. But then they had themselves a segment of the population that were known as split brain people, because their brain had been, the connection between their brain had been sliced through. And so they had some interesting experiments with those people that taught them a lot about what the left brain is responsible for cognitively and what the right brain is responsible for, or should say, how they play out. And what they discovered was something very interesting, particularly interesting to Zen students. And that is that the left brain is the part of our brain that recognizes patterns. In other words, we learn to speak, we learn to read and write because of that ability of our left brain to recognize patterns. It also is very vocal. It's the seat of speech and conversation. The right brain can understand, but it can't speak. And when stress takes place, the right brain tries to create, the left brain tries to create stories around what's going on. And the stories they discovered are often quite inaccurate. I'm letting that sink in a minute. At a certain point, if we go deep enough in our practice, we learn that we cannot trust our thoughts. And that is a very important point in practice, because we can't. The left brain is so good at analyzing and trying to come up with a reason for things that it will create a story regardless of whether it's accurate or not. And they have found out in these experiments that quite often it's not accurate. So what we think cannot be trusted. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why miscommunication happens so much, and why people get into fights about, I said this, no you didn't, you said that. I did this, no you didn't, you did that, and so on and so forth. Because our brain comes up with a plausible story that may or may not have a basis in reality. It's also interesting that a woman named Jill Bolte Taylor, who went into the science of the brain, she's specifically a neuroanatomist, connected with Indiana University Medical School, which is where my brother got his medical degree, by the way. And she went into it because her brother is schizophrenic. And she was fascinated trying to figure out the difference between how their brains worked, why her dreams were recognizable as dreams and his were not. They became reality for him. And so she actually is a Ph.D. in this field of neuroanatomy, doing post-mortem studies on people, animals, and so on, to try to figure out what goes on in which parts of the brain. And at one point, in the early 2000s, she had, at age 37, a very impressive stroke. And it was a left brain stroke. And she was in the unique position, because her right brain was unharmed, to comprehend the nature of her own stroke and to actually learn a lot about strokes. It was quite a massive stroke. It started when she woke up. She woke up to the alarm clock one morning and felt this piercing, intense pain behind her left eye. She thought, oh, I've got a headache, although she didn't normally get headaches. And she was also in excellent physical condition. She decided to go ahead and go forward with the routine of her day, which starts out with exercise. And she got on some kind of exercise machine, it's not specified, and started working out. And the headache got worse. So she got off and decided to go take her shower. And in the shower, she started having interesting shifts in perception. She didn't, for example, recognize her own arm. She felt that there was no boundary between who she was and everything else. No boundary. Eventually, she felt the need to call for help, and she did, and it was 8 years of recovery before she was able to, I don't want to say be herself again, because she wasn't herself again. She had seen so clearly that she wasn't a self, that her life was forever changed in very positive ways. And there's a TED Talk by her that you can probably still listen to if you're interested. It was the first TED Talk that went viral. There was also an article about her in the New York Times some years back as well. And if you want to read more details, she actually wrote a book about it. It was published in 2000. Well, there's 2 different versions of the book, or maybe 2 different editions of the book, one 2006, one 2009, in which she describes the whole thing. And it changed her life. Some interesting things took place. I tried to print this out, and it was having trouble with the printer, so I'm not sure any of this is actually in order, but we'll try. Starts out, this is an article in Oprah magazine, titled A Brain Scientist's Insight, and it's written actually by Dr. Mehmet Oz. Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor is a Harvard-trained neuroanatomist, a scientist who specializes in how the brain works. And in 1996, she suffered a massive stroke when a blood vessel burst in the left hemisphere of her brain. She was rushed to the emergency room and treated, but it took a full 8 years for Jill to journey back. And here, this is important. During the entire ordeal, Jill remained conscious, and she wrote a detailed account of the day of her stroke and the subsequent years of recovery in this book that's called My Stroke of Insight. At the morning of her stroke, she says she lost everything. I was just an infant in a woman's body. I couldn't walk, talk, read, write. No recollection of my life, no recollection of anything. And here's something important, no identification with anything in the external world, she says. It wasn't necessarily a bad experience either. And this is another interesting piece that shows the difference between left and right brains. Jill says she eventually realized she had to call for help. And the only problem was the part of her brain that understands numbers and making phone calls was the part that was damaged by the stroke. 911 was swimming in a pool of blood, Jill says. That was right where the site of hemorrhage happened. Calling for help became a 4-hour process. First, she found a coworker's business card. I put the business card next to the telephone pad, and then I matched the shape of the squiggle to the shape of the squiggle on the phone pad. Then I would push that, she says. I had to cover the number that I'd already dialed because I would drift out into no consciousness of reality. When she finally managed to dial her colleague's number, she heard him speak but couldn't understand him. I think to myself, oh my gosh, he sounds like a golden retriever. Then she tried to answer him, and I think, oh my gosh, I sound like a golden retriever. Until that point, Jill says, she understood her voice inside her own brain, but when she tried to communicate with the outside world, she had no luck. But obviously her colleague understood, and somehow she got help. With regard to her recovery, she talks about how she was able very, very sensitively to perceive the energy, the quality of energy of the people around her. And this is a right brain thing. The reason why I'm getting into all this right brain, left brain thing is to help you understand, A, why it can be difficult to do Zen practice, and B, to help you realize that it's actually, if you do understand it, then it becomes no problem. I've already said that when stress happens, or when there's a possibility that the left brain's abilities are going offline or being overridden by right brain efforts, that suddenly what happens is the left brain starts talking faster and louder. Many, many thoughts start spilling out. And it's also known that as we extend the out-breath, it dampens down our, I don't know if that's the right word, but it begins to take the left brain offline, and the left brain objects mightily by throwing up a barrage of thoughts. It's very interesting that throughout her stroke, and it was quite a massive stroke, she was not afraid at all. That's the right brain at work. At peace with what is. She wasn't in any danger. We don't know what would have happened, and by that I mean external danger. Nobody was lurking in her house to try to kill her, for example. I don't know what the right brain would have done under those circumstances, but most likely tuned into the energy of the person that was in the house and caused an alarm within. The abilities that she found, despite that she couldn't speak, or that when she did speak, it was nonsense, because her left brain that could do analysis and patterning was offline, that there was no fear, that there was simple ease. It's also interesting that she felt no boundaries. And that's another thing that can take place when we go deeply enough. We recognize that we are one with everything. One with the chairs, one with the clocks, one with the traffic on the highway, one with everyone else sitting here and with the mats and cushions we're sitting on. And the freedom that she experienced and the life transformation that she experienced is also something that comes forth through deep zazen that's deep enough to come to awakening. There is not a single awakening experience. There are degrees, depending on how deeply we go and how completely open we become, and how it manifests also is somewhat culturally expressed. If you do happen to read the Enlightenment stories in the 3 Pillars of Zen, and I would not suggest that you study them, because they're not going to be however it would happen for you, but only to get a sense of how different the experience can be for people, how differently it can manifest for people. Which is another reason not to have any ideas about it, because any idea about it is going to get into the way of actually doing your practice deeply enough to experience it. Form is emptiness. She realized that. Emptiness is also form. But this no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind that we chant when we're chanting the Prajnaparamita, which is the Buddha's core teaching, how can that compute? And in fact, there was a child who became a Zen master when his teacher said to him, his teacher, this is quite ancient times, so they were teaching him the Buddhist teachings and the Confucian teachings and so on. And it came to no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. He said, but I have a nose right here. I have eyes. I got a body. So how come I can say no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind? Well, anyone who has worked successfully on the Koan Mu understands that possibility. Who we think we are is a story. And even if you ask people that know you about that story, you'll get a different story. What's the reality? This is what we're searching for in our practice. And with that extended out-breath, we have an amazingly powerful tool to search with. It requires going beneath words. It requires persistence. It requires increasingly letting go our hold on the cliff, as the saying goes, our attachment to this self-image, this assumption of who we are. And yet, who we really are is so beyond comprehension and so amazing and so incredible and so free. This is why people over centuries, over millennia, have sought to experience it personally. And everyone here can, if you persist. So I hope you persist. I thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.